Hi, folks. With Tacitus today, your pushback channel. Thank you for joining this audio live stream. In this essay, I'd like to talk about the supposedly vexing question that no Western politician appears able to deal with. President Trump's probably the only one that seems to be making an effort in this regard. But this why are house prices, home prices, residential real estate, why are home prices so far away from matching or being even aligned with the purchasing power of the average paycheck? Typically, local real estate in any country or city, region, the price of the real estate is going to reflect the purchasing power of the people that are there. I mean, that seems to be a statement of the obvious. I mean, how could it be otherwise? If you're a builder building houses that people can't afford to buy, then you don't sell any houses. So, but why has this occurred? In Australia at least, the house prices were, when the average wage, this is going back into the 60s, when the average wage was $4,000 a year. The average house price was $10,000 a year. When wages were $8,000 a year, the average house price was $20,000 a year, and so on. And then this relationship between purchasing power of the average wage and the house price stayed pretty close. There was a little bit of oscillation in and around that average and that median and so on, but it stayed pretty close. People can't afford to buy houses that are outside of their purchasing power range. So again, obvious, and goods and services need to reflect in any sort of market-driven economy the capacity of people to pay for those goods and services, houses and homes included. This began to change. Now, there are a few little tinkering changes. For example, certainly when I was a kid, you had to have, if it was a block of land, if you're buying a block of land, you had to have 30% of the purchase price. You had to have that as a deposit. If you're buying a house, you could negotiate, and if your income was high enough, they'd let you go to about 20% if it was house and land together. But typically they'd want 25%. In some cases, if you're buying land in a new development where the services hadn't been fully put in yet, such as transport links, that sort of thing, then they would want 40% down. So that was how it was then. You had to save up for a deposit, and you had to be a very disciplined saver, and you had to live in fairly Spartan circumstances while you saved that money. Not everyone could do it, by the way. Not everyone had that sort of discipline, but anyway, the gap then began to change between purchasing power and house prices, and this particularly kicked off there was a brief burst when they reduced, so you could put 5% down to buy a house. That was also, there's a few other little changes, like you had to be an actual real married couple, but then they would accept dual ownership from de facto relationships. That also altered a few things, but essentially that dynamic and that relationship between purchasing power and the house price, that stayed, that didn't alter. And then mass migration began. And at the same time as mass migration began, offshore buying and institutional buying of property began to become a thing. And I've been to properties where, auctions of properties where offshore buyers are buying everything. The whole sheet of the auctions on the Saturday mornings, typically at a time. The whole sheet is all purchased by offshore buyers. Nothing's purchased by local people. They can't afford that anymore. And this holds true today. You can drive past or stop briefly and just have a look in at certain home auctions that are going on and find, there's not a single white person there, not one. And they're all talking, everyone there, whether they be Indians or Chinese, it's nearly always them, are all talking in their local language. Now, I don't speak any of the Indian languages, but I can understand enough of Mandarin to have a pretty decent grasp of what they're talking about. And they're all representing offshore buyers in China. The local people are just nominees representing the big money back in China. So there's very little local purchasing. The only people that I see anywhere, certainly in the area that I'm in or that I'm aware of, that are purchasing homes in Sydney or Greater Sydney, people who've just got a big inheritance. Their folks have died and they've got a big enough inheritance that they go out buying property. There is not a single purchaser I'm aware of that I've seen or heard of, or that anyone I know is aware of, that is able to buy property without an inheritance, or again, they're an offshore buyer. So that's the situation that local people from their wages, even people who are in the top 10% of incomes, they can't afford to do it. You need to be in the top sort of a quarter of 1% before you can be a player in average house prices in Sydney. So 1 in every 400 wage earners, maybe 1 every 300, if you want to be generous, can afford to play the property game. So the amount of local people that can buy property, residential property, is tiny. Now this is borne out in just looking over stats in some of the bigger American cities, where there's been some number crunching going on there. So the bigger cities like New York or Los Angeles, Miami, those sort of places, and local buyers, local people that are buying, citizens buying property, are just on 1 in 4. Only 25% of residential house sales are going to actually local people. The rest are going to the big ticket funds like the BlackRocks and so on, or offshore buyers. Even where there's a local buyer, this is frequently, if you like, there's someone who's got local residency, and they're running a conga line of illegal immigrants that are then effectively pooling their money to buy property. So there could be 20, 25, 30, 40 owners of the property, all working their illegal pizza delivery jobs, but then they're able to pay the mortgage. So if you actually have just local citizens, the mum, the dad, the 1.5 kids or something like that, they're now a tiny proportion of the buyers, because they simply can't afford it. They just can't play. And if they are buying it, it's in some outer down at heel suburb, because that's the only places where they can afford it from their wages. So this is the scenario, and this is totally different how it used to be. I remember as a kid, the factory worker could go and buy a house. They're just working at the local factory, not a skilled guy. Could go and buy a house, and they could afford to buy a house, own a mass-produced entry-level motor vehicle. The house would be modest. It would be 3-bed, 1 bath, a carport, and that'd be it. There was nothing lavish, and houses are bigger today. So many have 2 bathrooms or double car garages, all that sort of thing. So it's different in that sense. But a single income guy could afford to have a dependent wife and 2.4 children, and again have a car, an annual driving vacation. That was all affordable from a factory worker's wage. I know people that used to work in grocery stores. I'm just thinking of one now, both coming to mind. They both had to work. He worked in the storeroom, taking the truck deliveries, that sort of thing. His wife worked part-time or casual on the checkout or doing something like that, and they had 2 children. And I mean, I wouldn't call them rich or well off. I mean, certainly not. But they had quite just a very basic entry-level house and a basic entry-level motor vehicle, and she had to take public transport to get to work, these sorts of things. So it was what we would call a fairly basic life, but they could afford to buy a house and bring up 2 children on 1.5 wages. And these were, again, in the day, among the lower wages around at the time. But they could do it. They could do it on those sort of wages. But now even people in the top 10% or top 5% of wages can't afford to do that. So that's the extent and how radical that detachment from purchasing power it's been. Why is there that detachment from purchasing power? Well, because bigger players with bigger money can come in and buy up residential homes. Now, the bigger players used to confine themselves to buying office real estate and commercial real estate, and that was fine. That's where the big guys can play it out. But this has gone into residential real estate, and they have access to big tax breaks and offsets that the local guy with with just his wage, he doesn't have access to any of those accounting facilities. So he's just, his own purchasing power is all that he's got. And again, you don't, every auction I've been to or seen or watched on some people video it and upload it to YouTube, every one that I've seen either has one or two, or hardly any, or no white people at all. All the buyers are Indian and Chinese. Now, doesn't that tell you something? I mean, do you need to actually? I mean, you get the odd, say, Russian or something like that, but again, they're all representing big money. They're not representing someone who's just working at a 9-to-5 job and all he's got is his wage. So these are issues to be considered. Now, I didn't realise that close to 75% of people, of groups, organisations, gangs, cartels, call it what you like, that are buying residential property, homes that are meant to be for people to live in and bring up their kids and that sort of stuff. 75% of those are not individual buyers, but again, they're the Black Rocks and the offshore investors. And I suspect that may even be worse in Australia than it is in, say, the United States. Now, the United States is a huge real estate, massive, whereas Australia is quite small. So it doesn't take that much purchasing of property in Australia in any given suburb or area or city before it quite drastically affects the pricing. Now, just looking at, there's another stat that I saw recently, which was 30% of the property in Australia is rental property, and there are 70% is owner property, owner occupied, and this is a good thing, shows a healthy economy. That's bullshit, absolute bullshit. The majority of property that's owned isn't owner occupied at all. It's nominee occupied, offshore, again, the offshore investor, the Black Rocks, the rich Chinese and Brahmin Indian investors and so on, buying up property left, right and centre, and then sticking their slaves in there, their wage slaves, their rural peasants in there to work in the takeout food shops and so on. And so the real estate market has been horribly corrupted in Australia. It's no longer a market, not even close. It's a rigged cartel pricing system, but everyone's got a vested interest in prices increasing. Real estate agents wanted, property owners, they want the huge appreciation in pricing. Local government want it because they can increase property taxes. Regional governments want it because they can increase transaction taxes. Everyone's got a vested interest in it. Now, it's socially horribly destructive, brutally destructive from a social perspective. And you're getting citizens to buy into and have skin in the overall game. But outside of that, nobody really wants affordable house prices. Everybody wants mass appreciation house prices, and therefore, the political class in particular now derive more than half their income from property speculation, whether it's renting or buying and flipping and so on, and they get the insider trading grift using the big banks and big financial institutions to do it, getting lined up with rich Chinese investors trying to launder their money and so on. So no one really has other than the citizenry, no one has an interest in all the people with power to correct the situation. Simply have no incentive to do it unless it's they get struck by attitudes regarding the common good. But I want to look at the 30% of the people, 30% of properties are rented, but the last statistics certainly that I saw from years ago was that the average amount of people in rented property was 1.6 per rented property. and it was close to 4.5 for owner-occupied. This is residential property, owner-occupied property. So going back decades, you had families living in often freestanding properties, families living in there, the 2 point mum, dad, 2.4 kids, that sort of stuff. Whereas rental was younger kids starting out, or younger people, or maybe people that at the very bottom end of the income scale, that sort of thing. But the average wage was enough then to buy a house. So and it reflected this. This was reflected in the number of people in an owner-occupied house versus the number of people in a rental property. This is now completely flipped. The only people that can own houses now, aside from the offshore investors, are people who've inherited a big chunk of money. No one else can afford to buy a property anymore. The 1 in 300 maybe, but they're a tiny proportion of the buying public. So it's reversed. So it's the baby boomers that bought houses when there was a close relationship between purchasing power and house prices. They now are in, but the kids have gone away, that sort of thing. They're in their 70s, and there's only 2 of them, or if they're a bit older, one of them's died. One of them living in the house. They lived in the house for pretty much all their adult lives. They don't want to have to leave the house. They may to go into, say, a retirement home, and then they sell that, and that money then becomes available to, say, their children. But if they've got more than 1 or 2 children, there won't be a big enough lump sum for those children to go out and buy property. So there's a limit there. If there's, say, four kids in the family, they're screwed. They're not going to get enough money to buy anything or do anything meaningful. So the owner-occupied thing is now less than 2 people per property, whereas the rental property, those renting is now increased to 5 per property. So it's been a complete reversal. So when they say that only 30% of properties are being rented, that may or may not be so, but the amount of people in it has changed. Therefore, when you actually look at the numerics of it, there are more people in rental, by quite a margin, there are more people in rental circumstances now than owner-occupied circumstances. And whether that owner-occupied is someone paying off a massive mortgage and hanging on by the skin of their teeth, or again, an older boomer person that bought the property in the 1970s or something, and when it was affordable relative to income. But there's been a huge shift in the number of people in rental conditions and a number of people in owner-occupied conditions, and that's something that's a massive flipping of the script from what it used to be. You've been a Tacitus today, your Pushback Channel, and thank you for listening.